Otto of the Silver Hand. Chapter 6. How Otto lived in the dragon's house. The gates of the monastery stood wide open, the world lay beyond, and all was ready for departure. Baron Conrad and his men-at-arms sat food in stirrups. The milk-white horse that had been brought for Otto stood waiting for him beside his father's great charger. "Farewell, Otto," said the good old abbot, as he stooped and kissed the boy's cheek. "Farewell," answered Otto in his simple, quiet way, and it brought a pang to the old man's heart, and the child should seem to grieve so little at the leaving. "Farewell, Otto," said the brethren that stood about. "Farewell, farewell." Then poor brother John came forward and took the boy's hand, and looked up into his face as he sat upon his horse. "We will meet again," said he, with his strange vacant smile, "but maybe it will be in paradise, and there perhaps they will let us lie in the Father's belfry, and look down upon the angels in the courtyard below." "Aye," answered Otto, with an answering smile. "Forward!" cried the Baron in a deep voice. With a clash of hoofs and a jingle of armor, they were gone, and the great wooden gates were shut to behind them. Down the steep, winding pathway they rode, and out into the great wide world beyond, upon which Otto and the brother John had gazed so often from the wooden belfry of the White Cross on the hill. "Hast been taught to ride a horse by the priests up yonder in Michaelsburg?" asked the Baron, when they had reached the level road. "Nay," said Otto, "we had no horse to ride, but only to bring in the harvest or the grapes from the further vineyards to the vintage." "Prut," said the Baron, "methought the abbot would have had enough of the blood of old days in his veins to have taught thee what is fitting for a knight to know. Art not afeard?" "Nay," said Otto with a smile, "I am not afeard." "There at least thou showest thyself a wolf," said the grim Baron. But perhaps Otto's thought of fear and Baron Conrad's thought of fear were two very different matters. The afternoon had passed by the time they had reached the end of their journey. Up the steep, stony path they rode to the Dragon Bridge, and the great gaping gateway of Drachenhausen, where wall and tower and battlement took darker and more foreboding than ever in the gray twilight of the coming night. Little Otto looked up with great wondering, awe-struck eyes as this grim new home of his appeared. The next moment they clattered over the drawbridge that spanned the narrow black gulf between the roadway and the wall, and the next were past the echoing arch of the great gateway, and in the gray gloomy of the grave courtyard within. Otto looked round upon the many faces gathered there to catch the first sight of the little Baron. Hard, rugged face seemed, and weather-beaten, very different from those of the gentle brethren among whom he had lived, and it seemed strange to him that there was none there whom he should know. As he climbed the steep stony steps to the door of the Baron's house, old Ursula came running down to meet him. She flung her arms round him and hugged him close to her. "My little child," she cried, and then fell to sobbing as though her heart would break. "Here is someone knoweth me," thought the little boy. His new home was all very strange and wonderful to Otto. The armors, the trophies, the flags, the long galleries with their range of rooms, the great hall below with its vaulted roof and its great fireplace of grotesquely carved stone, and all the strange people with their lives and thoughts so different from what he had been used to know. And it was a wonderful thing to explore all the strange places in the dark old castle, places where it seemed to Otto No one could have ever been there before. Once he wandered down a long, dark passageway below the hall, pushed open a narrow, iron-bound oaken door, and found himself all at once in a strange new land. The gray light, coming in through a range of tall, narrow windows, fell upon a row of silent, motionless figures carved in stone, knights and ladies in strange armor and dress, each laying upon his or her stony couch, with clasped hands, and gazing with fixed, motionless, stony eyeballs up into the gloomy vaulted arch above them. There lay in a cold, silent row all of the Velfs, who had died since the ancient castle had been built. It was the chapel into which Otto had made his way, now long since fallen out of use, excepting as a burial place of the race. At another time he climbed up into the loft under a high-peaked roof, where lay numberless forgotten things covered with the dim dust of years. There a flock of pigeons had made their roost and flapped noisily out into the sunlight when he pushed open the door from below. Here he hunted among the moldering things of the past until, oh joy of joys, in an ancient oaken chest he found a great lot of worm-eaten books that had belonged to some old chaplain of the castle in days gone by. They were not precious and beautiful volumes such as the Father Abbot had shown him, but all the same they were quaint painted pictures of the blessed saints and of angels. Again, at another time, going into the courtyard, Otto had found the door of Melchior's tower standing invitingly open, for old Hilda Schwartz, Karl's wife, had come down below upon some business or other. Then upon the shaky wooden steps Otto ran, without waiting for a second thought, for he had often gazed at those curious buildings hanging so far up in the air, and had wondered what they were like. Round and round, up and up, Otto climbed until his head spun. At last he reached a land stage, and gazing over the edge of the down, behold the stone pavement below, far below, lit by a faint glimmer of light that entered through an arched doorway. Otto clutched tight hold of the wooden rail. He had no thought that he had climbed so far. Upon the other side of the landing was a window that pierced the thick stone walls of the tower, and out of the window he looked, and then drew suddenly back against with a gasp. For it was through the outer wall he peered, and down, down below in the dizzy depths he saw the hard gray rocks, where the black swine looked no larger than ants in the distance, fed upon the refuse thrown out over the walls of the castle. Then lay the tree-tops like a billowy green sea, and the coarse thatched roofs of the peasant cottage, round which crawled the little children like tiny human specks. Then Otto turned and crept down the stairs, frightened at the heights to which he had climbed. At the doorway he met Mother Hilda. "Bless me!" she cried, starting back and crossing herself, and then, seeing who it was, ducked him a curtsy with as pleasant a smile as her foreboding face, with its little deep-set eyes, was able to put upon itself. Old Ursula seemed nearer to the boy than anyone else about the castle, excepting it was his father, and it was a new-found delight to Otto to sit beside her and listen to her quaint stories, so different from the monkish tales that he had heard and read at the monastery. But one day it was a tale of a different sort, and she told him, and one that opened his eyes to what he had never dreamed of before. The mellow sunlight fell through the window upon Ursula, as she sat in the warmth with her distaff in hand, while Otto lay close to her feet upon a bearskin, slightly thinking over the strange story of a brave knight and a fiery dragon that she had just told him. Suddenly Ursula broke in the silence. "Little one," she said, "thou art wondrously like thy own dear mother. Didst thou ever hear how she died?" "Nay," said Otto, "but tell me, Ursula, how it was." "'Tis strange," said the old woman, "that no one should have thee told in all this time." And then, in her own fashion, she related to him the story of how his father had set forth upon that expedition in spite of all that Otto's mother had said, beseeching him to abide at home, and how he had been foully wounded, and how the poor lady had died from her fright and grief. Otto listened with eyes that grew wider and wider, though not all with wonder. He no longer lay upon the bearskin, but sat up with hands clasped. For a moment or two after the old woman had ended her story, he sat staring silently at her. Then he cried out in a sharp voice, "And is this true that you tell me, Ursula? Did my father seek to rob the townspeople of their goods?" Old Ursula laughed. "Aye," she said, "that he did, and many times. Ah, me, those days are all gone now." And she fetched a deep sigh. "Then we will live in plenty, and had both silks and linens and velvets beside in the store closets, and were able to buy good wines, and live in plenty upon the best. Now we dress in frieze, and live upon what we can get, and sometimes this is little enough, and nothing better than sour beer to drink. And there is one comfort in all this, and that is that our good Baron paid back the score he owed the Trutstrachen people, not only for that, but for all that they had done from the very first." Whereupon she went on to tell Otto how Baron Conrad had fulfilled the pledge of revenge that he had made upon Otto, how he had watched day and day after until one time he had caught the Trutstrachen folk with Baron Friedrich at their head in a narrow defile back of the Kaiserberg, of the fierce fight that was then fought, and how the Rodbergs at last fled, leaving Baron Friedrich behind them wounded, of how he had knelt before the Baron Conrad, asking for mercy, and how Baron Conrad had answered, "Aye, thou shalt have such mercy as thou deservest," and had therewith raised his great 2 hands sword and laid his kneeling enemy dead at one blow. Poor little Otto had never dreamt that such cruelty and wickedness could be. He listened to the old woman's story with gaping horror, and when the last came, and she told him with a smack of her lips how his father had killed his enemy with his own hand, he gave a gasping cry, sprang to his feet. Just then the door at the other end of the chamber had noisily opened, and Baron Conrad himself strode into the room. Otto turned his head, and seeing who it was, gave another cry, loud and quivering, and ran to his father and caught him by the hand. "Oh, father," he cried, "oh, father, is it true that thou hast killed a man with thy own hand?" "Aye," said Baron grimly, "it is true enough, and I think me I have killed many more than one. But what of it, Otto? Thou must get out of this foolish notion that the old monks have taught thee. Here in the world it is different from what it is at Michaelsburg. Here a man must either slay or be slain." But poor little Otto, with his face hidden in his father's robe, cried as though his heart would break. "Oh, father," he said again and again, "it cannot be. It cannot be that thou who art so kind to me should have killed a man with thine own hands. Then I wish that I were back in the monastery again. I am afraid out here in the great wide world. Perhaps somebody will kill me, for I am only a weak little boy, and could not save my own life if they chose to take it from me." Baron Conrad looked down upon Otto, all this while drawing his bushy eyebrows together. Once he reached out his hand as though to stroke the boy's hair, but drew it back again, turning angrily upon the old woman. "Ursula," he said, "thou must tell the child no more such stories as these. He knoweth not at all of such things as yet. Keep thy tongue busy with the old woman's tales that he loves to hear thee tell, and leave it with me to teach him what becometh a true knight and a wolf." That night the father and son sat together beside the roaring fire in the great hall. "Tell me, Otto," said the Baron, "dost thou hate me for having done what Ursula told thee this day?" Otto looked for a while into his father's face. "I know not," said he at last, in his quaint, quiet voice, "but methinks that I do not hate thee for it." The Baron drew his bushy eyebrows together until his eyes twinkled out of the depths beneath them, and then of a sudden he broke into a great loud laugh, smiting his horny palm with a smack upon his thigh. Chapter 7. The Red Cock Crows on Drachenhausen. There was a new emperor in Germany, who had come from a faraway Swiss castle, Count Rudolph of Habsburg, a good, honest man, with a good, honest, homely face, but bringing with him a stern sense of justice and of right, and of determination to put down the lawlessness of the savage German barons among whom he had come as emperor. One day 2 strangers came galloping up the winding path to the gates of the dragon's house. A horn sounded thin and clear. A parley was held across the chasm in the road between the 2 strangers, and a porter had appeared at the little wicket. Then a messenger was sent running to the Baron, who presently came striding across the open court yard to the gateway to parley with the strangers. The 2 bore with them a folding parchment with a great red seal hanging from it like a clot of blood. It was a message from the emperor demanding that the Baron should come to the imperial court to answer certain charges that had been brought against him, to give his bond to maintain the peace of the empire. One by one, those barons who had been carrying on their private wars, or had been despoiling the borough folk in their traffic from town to town, and against whom complaints had been lodged, were summoned to the imperial court, where they were expelled to promise peace and swear allegiance to the new order of things. All those who came willingly were allowed to return home again after giving security for maintaining the peace. All those who came not willingly were either brought in chains or rooted out of their strongholds with fire and sword, and the roofs burned over their heads. Now it was Baron Conrad's turn to be summoned to the imperial court, for complaint had been lodged against him by his old enemy of Trutz-Drachen, Baron Henry, the nephew of the old Baron Frederick, who had been slain while kneeling in the dust of the road back in Krasberg. No one at Drachenhausen could read but Master Rudolph the steward, who was sand-blind, and little Otto. So the boy read the summons to his father, while the grim Baron sat silent, with his chin resting upon his clenched fist, and his eyebrows drawn together into a thoughtful frown as he gazed into the pale face of his son, who sat by the rude oaken table with a great parchment spread out before him. Should he answer the summons, or scorn it, as he would have done under the old emperors? Baron Conrad knew not which to do. Pride said one thing, and policy another. The emperor was a man with an iron hand, and Baron Conrad knew what had happened to those who had refused to obey the imperial command. So, at last, he decided that he would go to the court, taking with him a suitable escort to support his dignity. It was with nearly 100 armed men clattering behind him, and that Baron Conrad rode away to court to answer the imperial summons. The castle was stripped of its fighting men, and only 8 remained behind to guard the great stone fortress and the little simple witted boy. It was a sad mistake. 3 days had passed since the baron had left the castle, and now the 3rd night had come. The moon was hanging midway in the sky, white and full, for it was barely past midnight. The high precipice banks of the rocky road threw a dense black shadow into the gully below, and in the crooked inky line that scarred with white face of the moonlight rocks, a band of some 30 men were creeping slowly and stealthily nearer and nearer to the castle Drachenhausen. At the head of them was a tall, slender knight, clad in light chain armor, his head covered only by a steel cap. Along the shadows they crept, with only now and then a faint chink or jingle of arms to break the silence. For most of those who followed the armed knight were clad in leather jerkins, only 1 or 2 wearing even so much as a steel breastplate by way of armor. So at last they reached the chasm that yawned beneath the roadway, and there they stopped, for they had reached the spot towards which they had been journeying. It was Baron Henry of Trutzdrocken, who had thus come in silence of night time to the dragon's house, and his visit boded no good to those within. The baron and 2 or 3 of his men talked together in low tones now, then looking up at the sheer wall that lowered above them. "Yonder is the place, Lord Baron," said one of those who stood with him. "I have scanned every foot of the wall at night for a week past, and we get not in by that way. We get not in at all. A keen eye, a true aim, and a bold man are all that we need. The business is done." Here again all looked upward at the gray wall above them rising up in the silent night air. High aloft hung the wooden bartizan or watch-tower, clinging to the face of the outer wall and looming black against the pale sky above. 3 great beams pierced the wall, and upon them the wooden tower rested. The middle beam jutted out beyond to rest the distance of the 5 or 6 feet, and the end of it was carved into the rude semblance of the dragon's head. "So good," said the baron at last. "Then let us see if thy plan holds, and if Hans Schmidt's aim is true enough to earn the 3 marks that I have promised him. And where is the bag?" One of those who stood near handed the baron a leathered pouch, and Baron opened it and drew out a ball of fine thread, another twine, a coil of stout rope, and a great bundle that looked, until it was unrolled, like a coarse fish net. It was a rope ladder. While these were being made ready, Hans Schmidt, a thick-set, low-browed, broad-shouldered archer, strung his stout rope, and carefully choosing 3 arrows from those in quiver, he stuck them point downward into the earth. Unwinding the ball of thread, he laid it loosely in the large loops upon the ground, so that it might run easily without hitching. Then he tied the end of the thread tightly round one of his arrows. He fitted the arrow to the bow and drew the feather to his ear. Twang! Rang the bowstring, and feathered messenger flew whistling upon its errand to the watchtower. The very first shaft did the work. Good, said Hans Schmidt, the archer in his heavy voice. The 3 marks are mine, Lord Baron. The arrow had fallen over and across the jutting beam between the carved dragon's head and the bartizan, carrying with it the thread, which now hung from above, glimmering white in the moonlight like a cobweb. The rest was an easy task enough. First the twine was drawn up to and over the beam by the thread, and then the rope was drawn up by the twine, and at last of all the rope laid by the rope ladder by the rope. There it hung, like a thin, slender black line against the light gray wall. And now, said the Baron, who will go first to win 50 marks for his own, and climb the rope ladder to the tower yonder? Those round hesitated. Is there none brave enough to venture? Said the Baron, after a pause of silence. A stout young fellow of about 18 years of age stepped forward and flung his flat leathern cap upon the ground. I will go, my Lord Baron, said he. Good, said the Baron. 50 marks are thine. And now listen. If thou findest no one in the watchtower, whistle thus. If the watchman be at his post, so that thou makest all safe before thou givest the signal. When all is ready, the others will follow thee. And now go, and good luck go with thee. The young fellow spat upon his hands and seized the ropes. Begin slowly and carefully to mount the flimsy stake ladder. Those below held it as tight as they were able. But nevertheless, he swung backward and forward and round as he climbed steadily upward. Once he stopped upon the way, and those below saw him clutch the ladder close to him, as though dizzied by the height and the motion. But he soon began again, up and up and up, like one great black spider. Presently he came out from the black shadow below and into the white moonlight, and then his shadow followed him step by step up the gray wall upon his way. At last he reached the jutting beam, and there again he stopped, for a moment clutching tightly to it. The next he was upon the beam, dragging himself towards the window of the bartizan just above. Slowly raising himself upon his narrow foothold, he peeped cautiously within. Those watching him from below saw him slip his hand softly to his side, and then place within his teeth. It was a dagger. Reaching up, he clutched the window-sill above him, and with a slight spring seated himself upon it. The next moment he disappeared within. A few seconds of silence followed, and then all of a sudden a sharp, gurgling cry broke the stillness. There was another pause of silence, and then a faint, shrill whistle sounded from above. Who will go next? Said the Baron. It was Hans Schmidt who stepped forward. Another followed the archer up the ladder, and another and another. Last of all went the Baron himself. Nothing was left but the rope ladder hanging from above and swaying back and forth in the wind. That night Schwartz Carl had been bowsing in over a pot of yellow wine in the pantry with his old crony, Master Rudolph, the steward, and the two chattering and gossiping together, and passing the night away until long after the rest of the castle had been wrapped in sleep. Then, perhaps a little unsteadily upon his feet, Schwartz Carl betook himself homeward to Malchoor Tower. He stood for a while in the shadow of the doorway, gazing up into the pale sky above him at the great, bright, round moon that hung like a bubble above the sharp peaks of the roofs, standing black as ink against the sky. But all of a sudden he started up from the post against which he had been leaning, and with his head bent to one side, stood listening breathlessly, for he too had heard that smothered cry from the watchtower. So he stood intently, motionlessly listening, but all was silent except for the monotonous dripping of water in one of the nooks of the courtyard, and the distant murmur of the river barren upon the breath of the night air. "Mehaps I was mistaken," muttered Schwartz Carl to himself. But the next moment, with the silence, was broken again by a faint, shrill whistle. What did it mean? Back of the heavy oaken door of the tower was Schwartz Carl's crossbow and portable windlass, with which the bowstring was drawn back, and a pouch of bolts. Carl Schwartz reached back into the darkness, fumbling in the gloom until his fingers met the weapon. Setting his foot in the iron stirrups at that end of the stock, he wound the stout bowstring into the notch of the trigger and carefully fitted the heavy, murderous-looking bolt into the groove. Holding his arbalest in his hand, stood silently waiting and watching in the sharp-cut black shadow of the doorway, motionless as a stone statue. Minute after minute passed. Suddenly there was a movement in the shadow of the arch of the great gateway across the courtyard. The next moment a leathern-clad figure crept noiselessly out upon the moonlit pavement and stood there listening, his head bent to one side. Schwartz Carl knew very well that it was no one belonging to the castle, and from the nature of his action, that he was upon no good errand. He did not stop to challenge the suspicious stranger, and taking of another's life was thought too small a matter for such thought or care in those days. Schwartz Carl would have shot a man for much smaller reason than the suspicious action of this fellow. The leather-clad figure stood a fine target in the moonlight for a crossbow bolt. Schwartz Carl slowly raised the weapon to his shoulder and took a long and steady aim. Just then the stranger put his finger to his lips and gave a low, shrill whistle. It was the last whistle that he was to give upon this earth. There was a sharp, jarring twang of the bow string, and the hiss of the flying bolt, and the dull thud as it struck its mark. The man gave a shrill, quivering cry, went staggering back, and then fell all of a heap against the wall behind him. As though in the answer to the cry, half a dozen men rushed tumultuously out from the shadows of the gateway whence the stranger had just come, and then stood in the courtyard looking uncertainly this way and that, not knowing from what quarter the stroke had come that had laid their comrade low. But Schwartz Carl did not give them time to discover that. There was no chance to string his cumbersome weapon again. Down he flung it upon the ground. "To arms!" he roared in a voice of thunder, and then clapped to the door of Melchior's tower and shot the great iron bolts with a clang and a rattle. The next instant the truth-stricken men were thundering at the door, but Schwartz Carl was already far up the winding steps. But now the others came pouring out from the gateway. "To the house!" roared the Baron Henry. Then suddenly a clashing clang uproar crashed out upon the night. Dong, dong! It was the great alarm bell from Melchior's tower. Schwartz Carl was at its post. Little Baron Otto lay sleeping upon the great rough bed in his room, dreaming of White Cross on the hill and of the brother John. By and by he heard the convent bell ringing, and knew that there must be visitors at the gate, for loud voices sounded through his dream. Presently he knew that it was coming awake, but though the sunny monastery garden grew dimmer and dimmer, his sleeping sight, the clanging of the bell, and the sound of the shouts grew louder and louder. Then he opened his eyes. Flaming red lights from torches carried here and there by people in courtyard outside flashed and ran along the wall of his room. Hoarse shouts and cries filled the air, and suddenly the shrill, piercing shriek of a woman rang from wall to wall, and through the noises the great bell from above upon Malkier's tower clashed and clanged its harsh, resonant alarm. Otto sprang from his bed and looked out of the window and down upon the courtyard below. "Dear God, what dreadful thing has happened?" he cried, and clasped his hands together. A cloud of smoke was pouring out from the windows, and the building across the courtyard, whence a dull, ruddy glow flashed and flickered. Strange men were running here and there with flaming torches, and the now continuous shrieking of women pierced the air. Just beneath the window lay the figure of a man, face downward upon the stones. Then suddenly Otto cried out in fear and horror, for as he looked with dazed and bewildered eyes down into the lurid courtyard beneath, a savage man in shining breastplate and steel cap came dragging the dark, silent figure of a woman across the stone. But whether she was dead or swoon, Otto could not tell. And every moment the pulsing of that dull red glare from the windows of the building across the courtyard shone more brightly, and the glare from other flaming buildings, which Otto could not see from his window, turned the black, starry night into a lurid day. Just then the door of the room was burst open, and in the rush, poor old Ursula, crazed with terror, she flung herself down upon the floor and caught Otto round the knees. "Save me!" she cried. "Save me!" as though the poor, pale child could be of any help to her at such a time. In the passageway without shone the light of torches, and the sound of loud footsteps came nearer and nearer. And still, though all the dim, sounded continuously the clash and clang and clamor of the great alarm bell. The red light flashed into the room, and in the doorway stood a tall, thin figure clad from head to foot in glittering chain armor. From behind this fierce knight with his dark, narrow, cruel face, its deep-set eyes glistening in the light of the torches, crowded 6 or 8 savage, low-browed, brutal men, who stared into the room at the white-faced boy as he stood by the window with the old woman clinging to his knees and praying to him for help. "We have cracked the nut, and here is the kernel," said the one whom stood behind the rest, and whereupon roar of brutal laughter went up. But the cruel face of the armed knight never relaxed into a smile. He strode into the room and laid his iron hand heavily upon the boy's shoulder. "Art thou the young Baron Otto?" said he in a harsh voice. "Aye," said the lad, "but do not kill me." The knight did not answer him. "Fetch the cord hither," he said, "and drag the old witch away." It took 2 of them to loosen the poor old Ursula's crazy clutches from her young master. And then, amid roars of laughter, they dragged her away, screaming and scratching and striking with her fists. They drew back Otto's arms behind his back and wrapped them round and round with a bowstring. Then they pushed him and thrust him through the room and along the passageway, now bright with the flames and that roared and crackled without. Down the steep stairway they drove him, where twice he had stumbled and fell amid roars of laughter. At last they were out into the open air of the courtyard. Here was a terrible sight, but Otto saw nothing of it. His blue eyes were gazing far away, and his lips moved softly with the prayer that the good monks of St. Michaelsburg had taught him, for he thought they meant to slay him. All round the courtyard the flames roared and snapped and crackled. 4 or 5 figures lay scattered here and there, silent in all the glare and uproar. The heat was so intense that they were soon forced back into the shelter of the great gateway, where the women captives, under the guard of 3 or 4 of Trosdrachen men, were crowded together in dumb, bewildered terror. Only one man was to be seen among the captives, poor old half-blind Master Rudolph, the steward, who crouched trembling among the women. They had set the blaze to Melchior's tower, and now below it was a seething furnace. Above the smoke roared the black clouds from the windows, but still the alarm bells sounded through all the blaze and smoke. Higher and higher the flames rose. A trickle of fire ran along the frame buildings hanging aloft in the air. A clear flame burst out at the peak of the roof, but still the bell rang forth its clamorous clangor. Presently those who watched below saw the cluster of buildings bend and sink and sway. There was a clash and a roar, and a cloud of sparks flew up as though to the very heavens themselves, and the bell of Melchior's tower was stilled forever. A great shout arose from the watching, upturned faces. "Forward!" cried the Baron Henry, and out from the gateway they swept across the drawbridge, leaving Drachenhausen behind them, a flaming furnace blazing against the gray of the early dawning.